Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me from in front of his very impressive collection of books is my good friend and co-author, Dan Welch. Dan, how you doing, pal?
I'm doing really well. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today, Chris. This has been a fun project.
We're talking about Grant versus Lee, the latest in the Emerging Civil War 10th anniversary series. Look, you've got no glare on your copy, so that's good. Dan and I co-edited this and pulled together some great contributions from a number of our colleagues with Emerging Civil War. Dan, give us the rundown. What's Grant versus Lee?
So, as we finished up the summer of '63, two companion volumes, Gettysburg and then Vicksburg, Tullahoma, Chris and I really had some conversations of where do we want to go next. And I think both of us quickly came to the conclusion that looking at, the second half of the war with these two towering figures, Grant and Lee, and everything that happens from the early spring of '64 all the way up through Appomattox is something that is not only in our bailiwick for many of our historians at Emerging Civil War, but it's just such a wide open field that our writers can provide traditionally on the blog, and some of the newer works that have been placed in here can really tread some new ground with.
Now, before we get into that, I want to kind of back up and have you tell a tale on me here, because you said we had to decide where we wanted to go next, because as you have told people, we were ready to take our relationship to the next level. Tell us a little bit about that and the part your wife played in that conversation.
When the idea for the 10th anniversary series came around, as a writer and a historian, one of the things that interested me about this whole project was that you would come to me and ask me if I'd be willing to co-edit these volumes with you, and at least get the series up off the ground. And it sounded really intriguing to me. I had never really taken the time to consider what I like to call the other side of the pen. I've over the years really honed my skills on researching. We always continue to grow the more we write. But I had not really sat down and critically been on that other side of, reading other people's works, really doing editorial and historical commenting and editing. So that's how the series started. But little did I know that being your co-editor was going to require the amount of emails, text messages, carrier pigeons, phone calls. I would say that our relationship really grew very, very tightly over the first two volumes. It got to the point here in Youngstown that anytime my phone went off, and I've got a different ringer for phone calls, a different sound for text messages, it didn't matter what sound it was. My wife's response, 9 times out of 10, let me guess, Chris Mackowski. So we spent a lot of time together, Chris and I, really working on those first two volumes, which I think are just outstanding contributions to the field of Civil War historiography. And I don't say that about our editing job so much as I say that about the writers and historians from ECW that are featured within those pages. There's just so much when it comes to the Gettysburg campaign that has been written. But I think that our historians have really found new ground to tread and lay down the works for. And with Vicksburg and Tullahoma really being underloved in Civil War historiography, that they brought a lot of strength and power forward in that particular volume as well. So you and I got to grow very closely together. I'm pretty sure there for a while, my wife thought that I was probably going to leave her for you and head down to Virginia, maybe just live on the battlefields down there somewhere. But once again, I had the privilege to join you with this third volume, Grant versus Lee, and she didn't even make the comment anymore. She just knew. It was like, this freak sense of knowing. The phone wouldn't even be ringing yet, and she was already walking out of the room, so we could have our private time together working on this volume. So it will forever be a saying in our house now. It's let me guess, Chris Mackowski.
Let me guess, Chris Mackowski. You talked a minute ago about how many of our contributors are well grounded in the Grant versus Lee story, and so this seemed like a natural next volume to do. What are some of those highlights? Tell me what do you mean that people are well grounded in Grant and Lee?
No, a lot of our cadre, our stable of historians with emerging Civil War, are very Eastern theater focused, not only in their research and their writing, but also in their employment. Some have worked at battlefields such as Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania and Chancellorsville and the Wilderness. Others have worked at state or local parks or museum sites related to those areas associated with the period of Grant versus Lee when Grant comes east. And then others have not only worked there, but have lived in the area, have walked the fields more than most, and have had those access to really delve deeply into the repositories in those areas. Obviously, if you're living there, it's an easier commute to go to this library or these archives and take those accounts out on the battlefield. So these historians have spent a lot of time and energy really bringing to life this period of Grant versus Lee, March of 64 through even May of 65, looking at some of the periphery as the lead ups to these campaigns. So they've done a great job over the years, not only learning and growing in those respective fields themselves, but being able to find those stories that have not been told during this time period, or well-tread stories debunking some of the myths of those, or perhaps writing some really foundational pieces for our blog readers that we've included. Some of these fights, I think of, the fighting at Saunders Field. I think of the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania. Some of these engagements are very complex with a lot of units, and being able to place some of those in a really easy to follow, easy to understand narrative to introduce some of that foundational knowledge to our readers that may be joining us from California or state of Washington or out in Kansas that haven't had the opportunity to walk those fields and cement those details in a chronological way. So this is just a great volume that I can't speak highly enough.
And, we are very conscious about not creating a narrative. You can't pick this up and suddenly
Yes.
read all the way from the Wilderness to Appomattox and get a comprehensive sense of what happened. But we did try to cherry pick highlights along the way that maybe we're not telling the narrative of the Mule Shoe, but here's a human interest story that comes from the Mule Shoe that sheds some additional light on that, which was an approach that we took with the Gettysburg and the Vicksburg Tullahoma books. And I thought it worked really well. And we've got sort of a sampling of stories to cover these 11 months as well.
Yeah, for example, one of the things that I think you and I consciously did in the Gettysburg volume, for example, is, we didn't devote any pages to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the 20th Maine. That is a story that's been well told by Chamberlain himself, starting in the days after the battle all the way up through current and present times. But instead, our historians and the pages that we did fill are some of those cherry pick stories along the way. You may have heard of Chamberlain, you've heard of Little Round Top, but perhaps what about the 83rd Pennsylvania, for example? There's an essay on there about another unit that was in the same brigade that Chamberlain's men were, but often are overlooked in the larger story. So you're 100% right. We took the same approach with this third volume, that we're not going to be able to cover every ounce of ground in a chronological narrative kind of way, where you're going to get in-depth research and writing on each and every one of these battles over this year and 2-3 month period that we're covering. But we've cherry-picked some of the very best stories from that period from our blog, as well as had some of our historians come back and add some new perspectives as well. So folks will get an opportunity to revisit some favorites on this time period, as well as read some new content.
And I think that's an important point, because it's not just a bunch of stuff that you can get for free on the blog. Even if you go to the blog today, each of these pieces has been augmented, expanded, footnoted, There are a couple of original pieces that are in this book. So it really does represent a best of, but there's also value added.
100%. I'll use myself for an example, just because I know that story pretty well. As you know, you and I were working on editing this particular volume. The opportunity for me to take a blog post series that I had done years ago, which was, kind of giving a step-by-step directions, if you will, to folks on how to research their Civil War ancestors and get more information on that story. Although I had written those blogs over a period of several months, I myself had never taken my own advice to research my own ancestor. So, I use this opportunity to, use that blog series, something that's already been read, and really expand upon it into something new, and add my own ancestors' Civil War service and story into this volume. So not only are you getting some of the stuff that you've already seen, but you're getting it expanded. You're getting maps with it, all new original maps. You're getting footnotes in there, so you're really getting a lot more than what we're able to put in on those blog posts on the website.
And I'll even say with the maps, we were pleased to work both with Hal Jesperson and with Edward Alexander. Even the original maps that Hal did for some of our emerging Civil War books, he actually updated those for us, and they're shiny and new. And then Edward did a lot of original stuff specifically for this book. People love their maps.
They do. And I think obviously my background here of just one wall of my library shows, there is nothing I hate more than getting a battle or campaign book with either really poorly done maps or no maps at all. Not only do I like to look at pictures, I'm a picture guy. I love looking at the maps. I have a very old love affair with maps from my Bruce Catton Centennial History of the Civil War, with those hand painted maps, the little guys on. I mean, I grew up as a kid opening that up, and my little toy soldiers, I place them on the book on those maps. So, to have Hal's maps, bright and shiny and new, and a lot of original maps from Edward Alexander, ECW's own, in here is just a huge benefit to the book.
You are kind when you say you have a love affair with maps. I think Chris White described my fascination as a fetish.
Well, I didn't want to reveal all of our secrets of our relationship today, Chris.
So the book picks up with Grant crossing the Rapidan River and heading into the wilderness, and goes all the way to the surrender at Appomattox. That's a lot of ground to cover, both historically and geographically. What was a challenge for you for managing that much terrain?
I think there was several challenges with that. The first of which is, when it comes down to editorial work, really looking at all of our different authors that had contributed pieces to this, and finding a common voice through all of them. So when you go from essay to essay, it's not a huge jarring experience, but at the same point in time, we can put these essays in a very loose chronological narrative, so that as you're reading, you can read it cover to cover and kind of follow the development of each campaign and each battle as we move from Grant coming east to the end of Appomattox and slightly beyond. But at the same point in time, I think that another challenge that really raised the level and the bar of these ECW 10th anniversary books was being able to include as many different voices as possible, and being able to make that smooth transition from piece to piece, making sure all of those voices were heard, and not only covering those big engagements, the wilderness, but even drilling down to much smaller things, like examining particular orders that were given at North Anna, or particular moments at Spotsylvania, such as a very brief window into some music that was played on the Spotsylvania earthworks and breastworks. So being able to cover, the old saying, a wide breadth, but a very surface level, but do it in a way that gives something for everyone, for the readers that pick up this book.
I think about Carolyn Davis's contribution, where she's doing a little poetry analysis. Herman Melville wrote about the fall of Richmond, and Carolyn has a piece about that. And then contrast that against the very micro-tactical movements of the opening engagements at Petersburg that Sean Chick wrote, which, in the fine tradition of micro-tactical history. And so you've got very different writing styles and very different topics. And for me, that's the fun thing about ECW in the first place, is you just have all these different writers with different writing styles and interests and backgrounds and approaches, and it's captured, I think, really well in this book as a result.
Yeah, and selfishly speaking, I think that was, one of the really benefits of coming on and working with you as a co-editor, was being able to read all this stuff before anybody else had the chance to, and getting such that variety and those insights, and learning about things that I hadn't learned yet. The Civil War is a massive topic of study. From those micro tactics to social history, to military history, to political history, to generals, to battles, to you name it. So one of the things that, as a historian in the field of Civil War studies, as enthusiasts, as buffs, as authors, you never want to stop learning. And what a great benefit that was, to be able to be the first one to learn these stories, and then you see this new research, and be able to bring it to our readership.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the hardest challenges, or the balancing acts of this book and the books in the series as a whole, is that different ECW authors do have those different interests and areas of expertise. And so, for instance, I'm looking out the window right now in my house, where I've got the wilderness, and my wife owns part of the Spotsy battlefield. So I naturally write more about those sorts of things because of my proximity and my interest. And there are other writers who don't write about that stuff. So maybe a book might feel a little Chris Mackowski heavy in a certain spot. And then as we go further south and we get to Petersburg, where Edward Alexander's expertise really picks up. And so then the book gets a little Edward heavy at times. And, with the Gettysburg stuff, you've got a lot of Gettysburg expertise. And so, finding a way to balance all that, where we're still being true to people's areas of expertise and areas of authority, but also making sure that it doesn't seem like we're beating anybody over the head with one particular person's stuff. That, to me, was a real challenge.
It is. It definitely can be a juggling act. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of those challenges was being able to weave together as many voices from emerging Civil War as possible. And at some points, you're going to read 2 or 3 essays in a row by Chris Mackowski. And as my wife would say, let me guess, Chris Mackowski. But you have spent a lot of time on some of those particular stories and moments in the Overland Campaign. For example, North Anna. You're one of those few North Anna guys out there. So of course you may have 2 or 3. Ed Alexander has been doing work in the Petersburg area and on the final breakthrough down there on that front for years. And so we wanted to make sure that not only were we getting that wide variety of sources, but capitalizing on the expertise from our stable of historians with emerging Civil War. If I've got a Petersburg question, for my own personal research or writing, I'm picking up the phone and calling Edward. If I've got a question about North Anna, I'm calling Chris Mackowski. So being able to have all of those voices and let them all shine equally is another benefit to the book, particularly where we drill down and get some of our folks that have really made a passion of some of these topics and areas of study.
So is there a contribution in the book that is a particular favorite of yours?
That is really hard to pick.
Yeah, there are a lot of good ones.
There are a lot of good ones. And I'd have to go back and do the raw math and counting, but I think we have probably more authors contributing to this volume than we have in the first 2. And so there's been a number of pieces that I really liked. I to name a few, because I don't want to give just one. I couldn't pick one. It's like picking your favorite kid.
Right.
You're not supposed to have a favorite child. In my case, we have 3 dogs. I've got a favorite out of the 3. Burt Dunkerley's Myths of Cold Harbor, I thought was a fascinating piece. We talk about Cold Harbor, comes to mind Grant the Butcher, enormous amount of casualties, and then the federal lines, and we kind of move on. We really tread the waters on these trodden tropes of the myths of Cold Harbor. So that really stuck out in my mind. There was a great essay in there, pretty short, on different brigade commanders and the deaths of brigade commanders during this period that Phil Greenwald did, which, we tend to focus on these battles and campaigns in isolationist pockets. All right, this date to this date was the Wilderness Campaign. These guys were killed. We don't really correlate that or add that up, and how that cumulative effect will play out in the officer corps. I think about an essay by Jonathan Tracy that was really interesting. Many historians, April 9th, the Civil War is over.
Oh, I thought it ended on May 10th, 1863.
Yeah, right. So he wrote a piece on the paroles of Confederate cavalry after Lee surrenders. How are these paroles being issued to this particular arm of the Army of Northern Virginia? Where are these guys going? How are they getting there? Following them back home, I thought was, an excellent piece. And I could go on and on about all of our authors and historians that have contributed. But those were some of the highlights for me. One last one that I'll share, which just fascinated me to no end. Our own naval historian, Dwight Hughes, he submitted a piece looking at what he called Grant's lifeline in City Point, Virginia, and how did the Federal Navy and the top commanders in that naval department work with Grant. We often think of Grant's overland campaign as such, that there are no important naval moments in the Eastern Theater in 1864, but 1864, 1865, Dwight proves us wrong and shows us just how critical Grant's lifeline was by the Federal Navy at City Point throughout the duration of 64 and 65. So there is something for everyone. I think there's going to be a lot of moments that folks will be reading this and saying, I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that story before. That's interesting. I want to know more on that.
Yeah. And you mentioned Phil Greenwald's piece about the fallen brigade commanders, and that makes me think one of our upcoming volumes in the series is about fallen leaders, and makes me think about the way that even we've got these sort of discrete books that really aren't going to be discrete. They're in conversation with each other. Our first book was about Gettysburg, but you've got some great Gettysburg pieces coming up in our next book, which is about monuments and memory. So again, that intertwinedness of the series is really important. What do you have coming up next for you? Because you're not actually co-authoring or co-editing the next one, but you are an author of a number of really cool segments.
Yeah, so I've been back to the other side of the pen and let that relationship with Chris Mackowski develop with others in our cadre of historians and hardworking folks at Emerging Civil War. So I could get back to the other side of the pen. In an upcoming volume on monuments and memory, I do have some pieces in there regarding earliest monuments at Gettysburg. When are some of the first monuments appearing on what was the battlefield but not yet preserved, and in many cases, what were the intentions of them? Monuments that are being placed in 1867, are they being used as a form of remembrance of the battle, form of remembrance for fallen comrades? Are they setting out to, particularly at Gettysburg, as the early historian of Gettysburg, John Batchelder, said, are they set out to really tell a narrative of what happened to Gettysburg based on these three-dimensional, very tangible objects being placed on the battlefield itself? So have a look at that. I've got another piece coming up in another volume looking at pop culture and the Civil War. Something very near and dear to my heart, a blog post I'd done several years ago, which I've since updated, on the Gettysburg soundtrack, and wearing that thing out on cassette, just playing that to no end. But then on the flip side, going into a profession first as a music teacher, a music educator, before completing that training and study as a historian, and how that music kind of impacted my life, and becoming crestfallen to learn that it wasn't real instruments, but it was all synthesized because of the budget for the soundtrack. So a wide variety of things such as that I'm really looking forward to having time to flesh out and tie into these subsequent volumes, which, giving us just a little sneak peek there. Chris, tell us what's coming up in the series. What can our readers look forward to? I know, I've left a couple spaces on my bookshelf after these first 3 volumes to start filling in as they come out.
And that was one of our goals when Dan and I were talking about this. It's like, we want it to look nice as a set on the bookshelf. And so very important as book lovers. So the next volume that'll be coming out is actually on Monuments in Memory, and that's actually co-edited by Dan's protege, John Tracy, who has done some great work on the blog talking about memory at Gettysburg in particular, but that's something that really fascinates John. And so he was just a great guy to take the lead on that. And then you mentioned earlier our naval historian, Dwight Hughes, who has pulled together a crew of authors to put together an ECW book on the War on the Water. And that's actually going through proofreading right now. The Monuments book is getting ready to go off to the printer. It's it's off in the publisher's hands, and they'll pull the trigger on that when they've got a moment in the printing schedule. We also have a volume on fallen leaders that's inspired by last year's ECW conference or symposium. And that was really based on just a long history of great blog posts that we've had over the past 10 years. So looking forward to that one. And then the pop culture book that you've mentioned as well. John Tracy is co-editing the pop culture one. Dwight's co-editing the Navy one. I'm doing the Fallen Leaders one myself. And then Sarah K. Byerly is pulling together War in the Western Theater. And that's based on a lot of just the stuff from the out west that people tend to forget about. But gosh, it might be where the war was won. So really giving that some important attention, I think, is really key. So that's what we've got coming up to round out the series. Now, Dan, I understand that you have parlayed your editorial experience and excellence into a new gig. Tell us a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, back in December of 2021, I was named the associate editor of the very long-running and well-known Gettysburg magazine. The current editor, Jim Pulla, who's been editor now for, I want to say about 10 years, is moving on and getting ready to retire. So I had the opportunity to work with Jim this year on the coming volumes this year. And then at the end of 2022, I'll be taking over the sole editor position with the University of Nebraska Press for that. And, again, selfishly, as I mentioned earlier, as an editor, being able to really get the first look at some of the scholarship and writing that's being done. And of course, every writer no one's perfect. And so, of course, you got to be looking for commas here. And you and I will continue that debate about the Oxford comma or not. It's a hot button issue in the editorial world.
People don't realize that's a hot one. Yeah.
No, if there was ever a necessity for a duel after Alexander Burr, it is over the Oxford comma. So having that opportunity to continue to hone that craft. It's editorial work and writing, being an author is something that you never reach perfection. It's something that you're always working towards to get better at. And at the same time, being able to really, through that work, being on the cutting edge of research. So I'm really looking forward to using everything that this series afforded me to bring to Gettysburg Magazine as an editor, and to really bring new scholarship and new perspectives as well to Gettysburg Magazine. So with that being said, to our audience, if you've always wanted to roll up your sleeves, we'd love to have you at Emerging Civil War. Start blogging for us. And at the same time, if you've got an interest with Gettysburg, reach out to me as well. We would love to feature new stories and fresh ideas and fresh voices to the conversation.
Now, when you were describing Gettysburg Magazine and described it as long running and well known, and I originally thought prestigious, and you will only add to its prestige. They're lucky
Well,
to have
thank
you
you.
in that capacity. So, as someone who works every summer at the battlefield, you know the content very well. You've got great experience from an editorial perspective. So, it's just a fantastic fit from my perspective, and the magazine is going to be lucky to have you.
I'll share a brief story, and I appreciate that. I hadn't really thought about the lineage of editors when I was named to this position. Of course, I had known about the prestige of the magazine. I have every issue dating back to volume 1. Some issues I have multiple copies that are battlefield copies. I've got them original printings as solo issues. I have them as bound volumes. So, I've had a long love affair with Gettysburg Magazine, but I just didn't really put that lineage of the editorialship position together. And I was giving a talk to a roundtable not long ago, and they said, "Oh my gosh, I mean, what's it like, following behind someone like Ed Bars as editor at Gettysburg Magazine?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I hadn't really thought about that lineage." So I'm looking forward to carry on many of the traditions of the editors in that magazine, as well as bringing a little flair of my own, if you will, to the audiences of the 21st century. So I appreciate the kind words, and one of those things is credit is where credit is due, and Emerging Civil War has been a great place to grow as a professional in the field of history and Civil War studies.
We've been lucky to have it. We've been lucky to have it.
Well,
so we've been talking about Grant versus Lee. Anything I haven't asked you about the book that I should have asked you, Dan?
Yeah.
So, all right, very good. Well, Dan, thanks for spending some time chatting about our project. I'll let your wife have you back now.
What a wonderful conversation. And to all of our viewers and listeners, I myself look forward to these volumes, not only completing my set. I'm a completist, got to complete the set on the bookshelf, but you should be as well. And these are things that you're not going to want to miss in your collection in your Civil War library.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm Chris Mackowski for Dan Welch. Thanks for joining us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.